This is for safety, taking an old pipeline out and putting a new one.
Tonight, Enbridge's Line 3 will be replaced, but that won't ease the concerns of those who say no to all pipelines.
The Aboriginal perspective has never been presented in history.
The debate over removing, changing, or adding the Indigenous voice to historical commemorations continues in Montreal.
If we don't connect with people and sort of raise awareness about Indigenous issues and Indigenous poverty, I think we're doing a disadvantage to ourselves.
And Generation Indigenous aims to strengthen the bond between all treaty people. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Construction on Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline project began in Manitoba this week. With a price tag of $8 billion, it's Enbridge's largest project to date. While the company says the new pipeline will be safer, Brittany Hobson tells us how one woman says there shouldn't be a pipeline at all.
It's day one of construction for the Manitoba portion of the Line 3 project. Just over 1,000 kilometers of pipeline from Hardisty, Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin is being replaced. Enbridge says they've spent the past 5 years coming to agreement with 95 Indigenous communities and organizations.
Those agreements address issues such as traditional land use, procurement and training and employment opportunities, environmental stewardship, and, of course, construction monitoring.
The controversial project is one of the largest infrastructure developments in the country. Grassroots organizations on both sides of the border oppose it. However, Chief Ken Chalmers says the Birdtail Sioux First Nation favors the project.
As far as there is concern, I see it every day, even in my community. But we got the big picture is, as long as it's safely done with our elders, and I've spoken to many chiefs about it, and it's about revenue for First Nations in the long run.
Enbridge says they've already pumped more than $120 million in Indigenous economic opportunities and expect that to double. This has resulted in dozens of jobs for Birdtail Sioux.
This is for safety, taking an old pipeline out and putting a new one.
Meanwhile, 60 kilometers away is the Spirit of the Buffalo Camp. It's being led by Two-Spirit land defender Geraldine McManus for the past 38 days of peaceful protest. She started the camp after receiving guidance during her time in Standing Rock.
Everyone needed to go home and stand up for their own territories because these pipelines are in all of our backyards and we need to start discussing them.
She says the camp has quickly turned into a place where people can have an open dialogue about Indigenous issues.
So, you have people who are defending me and you have people who are just hating on me over there, and that's just fine because people are feeling emotion. And I think whether it's hate or whether it's upset or whether it's agreeing with me, the conversation has begun.
McManus isn't sure what will happen when construction reaches the camp, but for now, she doesn't plan on leaving. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, near Gretna.
A recent incident at an A&W restaurant in Cardston, Alberta, is only one example of racial discrimination in the small town. Tamara Pimentel has the story now of how Alberta Health Services suspended a doctor of the Cardston clinic after he allegedly made racist comments to a group of Indigenous people, and the lawyer who wants to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Indigenous advocate and lawyer Ingrid Hess is visiting the Nitsitapi Peace Camp. It was set up to raise awareness of the ongoing racism experienced by the neighboring blood tribe in Cardston. But one incident in particular prompted the setup of the camp and caused Hess to pay a visit.
I was just appalled about what I heard, and I thought it needs to be documented. These situations so often just go uninvestigated.
She's referring to a Facebook post by Scott Many Grey Horses that went viral in the community back in May. He alleges that he witnessed Dr. Lloyd Clark, a physician of the Cardston Clinic, approach a group of homeless Indigenous people, telling them they needed to get jobs and not be hanging around. Many Grey Horses also said Clark made a reference about the homeless looking for a prescription for Tylenol 3s. Hess found the people who had been harassed, took their statements, and filed a complaint.
Especially that a person who Indigenous people rely on for care in the health system would be expressing views or expressing ideas that are really offensive and speak to prejudice and stereotyping and judgmentalism that just shouldn't have a part in that kind of profession.
Alberta Health Services has suspended Clark. In an email to APTN, AHS says there is no excuse for the comments allegedly made. It admits that trust is a significant barrier to First Nations people accessing the healthcare system. They acknowledge that institutional racism and stereotyping have kept people from getting the care they need. AHS says while the investigation is ongoing, Dr. Clark is on administrative leave from his position, but he is still providing services in the emergency department in Cardston. Hess also filed a complaint with the Alberta College of Physicians and Surgeons. It found there was insufficient evidence that Dr. Clark had engaged in unprofessional conduct. Hess filed an appeal of that decision and hopes the actions of the Nitsitapi Peace Camp exposes more racist acts.
I hope the stories start coming out more and that people demand a change and demand better treatment, demand respect, because it's not acceptable what's happening.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Cardston.
The recent removal of some statues from Halifax to Victoria has been viewed as acts of reconciliation. But one Mohawk man in Montreal is upset at the recent change to a historic plaque deemed insulting to his people. Tom Fenario has that story.
It's the kind of inconspicuous thing people walk past every day in the city. Plaques on an old building. Even people who have stopped to look at this particular one before probably haven't noticed that recently it changed.
I'm still in shock. I still have mixed emotions.
Michael Rice is a history teacher. He's also a Mohawk from nearby Ganawage. It was in 1992 when he first noticed this engraving in Old Montreal paying tribute to a victory of the city's founder, Paul de Chamedy de Maisonneuve, over the Iroquois in 1644. One line in particular struck Rice as being in poor taste. De Maisonneuve killing the chief with his own hands.
They make it sound like they were just goldfish waiting to be killed. And Aboriginal and Haudenosaunee people are much more resilient than goldfish or sheep waiting to be slaughtered. And we could give as good as we can get, too.
Last week, the killing the chief with his own hands line from both the English and French plaques were removed. But that wasn't what Rice had in mind. Even though Rice says the previous plaque was in poor taste, he would have left it up as an example of how history used to be told, from one side only.
By changing that last sentence that they took out, kind of changes the context of what we were talking about, which was not taking down any plaques, was actually just adding a third plaque with the Ganyagahaga perspective.
In an email to APTN News, the Bank of Montreal, or BMO, says that they will reach out to Rice on adding a new plaque and creating a First Nation committee to oversee the appropriate text of the new plaque.
Why it's important is that, first of all, the Aboriginal perspective has never been presented in history. And secondly, and probably most importantly, is that it gives us a chance to reflect on where we've come from and where we are today.
Sitting across from the BMO building is Montreal's historic Place d'Armes, a monument to where de Maisonneuve and French settlers won a skirmish against the Iroquois. As a history buff, Rice doesn't want any of it to be erased. But as a Mohawk man, he is looking forward to his people finally having their side told. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
There are calls for changes in Winnipeg as well. Bishop Grandin Boulevard is a major roadway that runs the length of the southern part of the city. St. Vital is a nearby neighborhood. Both are named after Bishop Vital Grandin, and some want the name scrapped. Melissa Ridgen reports.
This is Bishop Grandin Boulevard. Here it connects to Winnipeg's busy Pembina Highway and the University of Manitoba campus. Here's Bishop Grandin Trail, a popular path for cyclists and joggers. And here, the old neighborhood of St. Vital. Truth is, most Winnipeggers have no clue who the bishop was, despite his name being everywhere. Even the plaque erected beside his boulevard only mentions him as a pioneer bishop. But those asking for his name to be erased from Winnipeg point out he was much more, and it's not all good. Seguin First Nation blogger Kelly Edwards isn't one of them, but he does want people to know more about the man.
He was actually a really huge driving force behind residential schools. You know, he lobbied. Yeah, so he lobbied very, very hard, and it was John A. MacDonald who signed on the dotted line.
In a letter to the government in 1880, the bishop wrote that residential schools would be the best way to ensure Indigenous children forget the customs, habits, and language of their ancestors. Because of that, 2 people wrote the city asking for the bishop's namesakes to be changed. St. Vital councillor Brian Mays feels there's a better way to deal with this complicated historical figure's legacy.
My suggestion is to add a plaque, a new plaque, or preferably some public art that explains this complicated legacy that Grandin was a champion for the Métis and French language rights, but was certainly a proponent for the residential school system.
This plaque is awkwardly placed where no one can even easily read it.
Councillor Mays would rather see that plaque move somewhere like here, the Bishop Grandin Trail. It's a 7-kilometer stretch used by joggers and cyclists to connect to the University of Manitoba and neighborhoods beyond. He said that there's also an opportunity for an installation of some sort around this trail, one that would explain the darker side of the Bishop's history.
I would like to add to that to do some public art as they did in Edmonton to educate the public about these issues.
With the Sir John A. Macdonald statue coming down in Victoria last weekend, Canadian political blogger Spencer Fernando says we're on a slippery slope.
Are we just going to wipe everything out, everything that's controversial? A lot of people see Louis Riel as controversial. We have a day for him. There's a statue of him outside the legislature in Manitoba. So at some point we have to say, look, we're going to teach about history, we're going to talk about history, the good and the bad, but to just wipe it out and say, oh, we're just going to pretend it didn't happen. I mean, lots of people in Western Canada hate Pierre Trudeau. He's controversial. Are we going to get rid of him? His name is on the airport in Montreal. We're going to get rid of all his statues, everything about him. Yeah, at some point we just have to draw the line and say, keep the statues, keep the history, and teach about it.
Councillor Mays doesn't expect the matter to be considered by City Council until after the October election. Melissa Ridgen, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The results of an investigation into the Whitehorse Correctional Centre are in. Details after the break. Here's a look at Saturday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. Rain and 18 for Charlottetown, 18 under the sun in St. John's. 14 and sunny skies in Nain, sunny and 20 for Happy Valley, Goose Bay. 23 under the sun in Val-d'Or and Chibougamau, 24 with sun in Saguenay. In southern Ontario, 26 in Sarnia, London, Toronto, and Ottawa. 26 under the sun in Thunder Bay, sunny, and 23 in Wawa, Timmins, and Kapuskasing. 22 and rain for Puckatawagan, rain, and 27 for God's Lake. Rain and 31 for Winnipeg, 30 and rain for Brandon and Gimli. In Saskatchewan, smoky and 25 in Swift Current. Smoke continues in Saskatoon with a high of 24. 17 and rain in Uranium City, 16 with showers for Stony Rapids. Welcome back. An Innu wind farm project in Quebec is being called economically nonsensical. With an October provincial election looming, the 9 Innu First Nations now find themselves in the middle of a political controversy. Tom Fenario joined us earlier to explain. Tom, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about this wind farm project and what makes it so controversial?
Well, the Puyet Wind Farm project is a joint venture between the Innu Nation, that's the group that represents the 9 First Nations, the 9 Innu First Nations in Quebec, and a private company named Boralex. Now, once completed, the wind farm project is expected to output up to 600 megawatts of energy. However, last week a letter was leaked to the press. The letter was written by Hydro-Quebec CEO Eric Martel and addressed the Innu chiefs. In the letter, it says that the energy company expects that the wind farm project will cost Quebec consumers up to $1.5 to $2 billion over 25 years. Now, Hydro-Quebec's reasoning is that wind energy costs up to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas other kinds of energy can cost as low as 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Hydro-Quebec also says that they are expecting to have a surplus of energy for the next 8 years. Now, the Innu Nation says that they are working to make this an economic project that has no impact on consumer bills. They also point to the fact that they expect that it will create 400 jobs in the region. They also say that the wind farm project will contribute to Quebec's eventual goal of having up to 4,000 megawatts of wind energy.
Now, Tom, it sounds like Quebec's political leaders are weighing in. What do they have to say?
Well, the CAQ, that's the Coalition Avenir du Québec, came down hard on the project, pointing towards the fact that it's going to cost more money and that there is currently an energy surplus. But the CAQ, as they're called here, is currently third when it comes to seats for a political party in Quebec. However, they are leading in polls right now, and the election is coming up fast on October 1st. So many are seeing it as a political play, if you will. Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Chief Ghislain Picard entered the fray recently, saying that the CAQ and their leader François Legault has no business interfering in economic development when it comes to First Nations, and says that now the First Nations in Quebec know where the CAQ stands when it comes to issues such as reconciliation. Quebec incumbent Premier Philippe Couillard still says he supports the project despite the recent controversy, if you will. Meanwhile, the Innu Nation issued a statement today saying that negotiations have begun right now. They are currently happening, and they are hoping to reach a mutual beneficial agreement, they say. Back to you, Dennis.
Well, it'll be interesting, Tom, to see how it plays out as the election looms. Appreciate you taking some time to tell us about it today.
Anytime. Thanks a lot.
To the Yukon now, where the government called for an investigation into the Whitehorse Correctional Center last fall. A report was produced by an independent inspector and was released in May. Now the government has responded. APTN's Luke Smith has more.
Our government has accepted the recommendations of Mr. Lucadelis.
40 recommendations were included in the inspection report into the policies and practices of the Whitehorse Correctional Center. Tracy Ann McPhee, Yukon's Justice Minister, says programs and services will improve for all inmates.
We will improve how we deliver programs and services at the Whitehorse Correctional Center to all inmates and enhance support for inmates with mental health and addiction issues.
The investigation was called after the public concerns over lack of First Nations programming and the use of separate confinement, particularly with inmates suffering from mental illness.
Yukon First Nations.
The Council for Yukon First Nations Executive Director Shadell Chambers wants to see immediate changes.
We want to ensure that some of the practices and services at WCC change immediately, and I think we're working towards some of these immediate things that can change quickly.
In the case of the use of segregation, Assistant Deputy Minister Alan Lucier hopes the recommendations in this report can lead to changes across Canada.
I think across Canada, in all jurisdictions, the use of separate confinement is one that's been under question. I think that the improvements that the recommendations put forward are sound recommendations, and I think they will lead this country in changes in the use of separate confinement.
Some of the changes include the development of culturally sensitive programs and services, as well as practices that are better aligned with First Nations values.
But I think it is encouraging in the report. As you can see, there are a number of First Nations recommendations, and that First Nations really need to be involved with the management of WCC and really corrections reform here in the Yukon because of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, and specifically at WCC, where at times we'll see over 70% of the clients at WCC are Indigenous.
With a new forensic mental health unit going into effect this week at the Whitehorse Correctional Center, an oversight committee is planned to be up and running by November. Luke Smith, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
A new festival to bridge the divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Calgary is being called a success. We'll take you there after the break. Here's the rest of Saturday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny and 30 for Grand Prairie. Rain and 19 in High Level. Rain and 27 for Medicine Hat. Showers and 24 in Calgary. Sun's out in Red Deer and 24. 33 with some showers in Kamloops. 29 under the sun for Penticton. 25 in Bella Coola. 15 and rain in Dease Lake. 25 and sunny skies for Fort Nelson and Fort St. John. In the Yukon, 17 and sunny in Dawson, and in Whitehorse, rain in Mayo with a high of 19. Over to NWT, 20 with showers in Yellowknife, 20 under the sun for Norman Wells, 23 and partly sunny for Fort Simpson. A high of just +1 for Sax Harbor on Saturday, 10 above with some showers in Pawlatuck, sunny and 16 in Colville Lake. 10 for Whale Cove, 11 under the sun in Repulse Bay, 17 with some rain in Cambridge Bay, 9 in Pangartung, 16 under the sun in Igloolik. Welcome back. Generation Indigenous is a new non-profit organization created to strengthen the bonds between all treaty people. For the past year, they've done community work around the city of Calgary, including planting a community garden. This week, they put on their first festival. Tamara Pimentel was there.
They will still have to wonder.
It isn't very often you'd see Indigenous and non-Indigenous people come together in the heart of downtown Calgary. But that's what this festival is about. A long time coming. An event put on by Generation Indigenous is meant to bridge the two groups together.
I think I realized it's just really important to sort of recognize the people who don't have voices.
Hannah Tai is an organizer who is passionate about Indigenous issues. She was born and raised in Calgary, but her family moved to Canada to escape the war in Vietnam.
My parents were refugees, and honestly, it was that whole process of trying to grapple with being Canadian and not Canadian at the same time, and realizing that there's also this other, group of people who have been marginalized, heavily marginalized in our communities, and like Indigenous people who, in a way, we both kind of experience the same sort of marginalization in two separate realms, though.
Indigenous organizer Joseph Plant says events like this are needed to educate the public.
I grew up here. I've seen the people on the streets that are Indigenous and that are hurting, and that they are going through a lot more than just what you see on the surface.
I learned a lot about Indigenous culture, but it always seemed like so far away, so long ago, in that this is what they did, this is how they hunted, this is how they lived. To realize that there's a population that still do that and still want to reconnect with that, and the whole reason they haven't had a chance to reconnect with that was because of our government.
People like Danny Keeler.
I am currently redefining who I am and rediscovering and reclaiming my identity.
This festival is a place for her to display and sell her beadwork, which portrays her newfound identity.
About last year when I got sober, and it's from there I started to be more spiritually awakened and practicing my culture and learning my language and going to ceremonies.
This is the first festival put on by Generation Indigenous, and it won't be the last. For this group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, joining together has been a long time coming.
If we don't have events like these, if we don't connect with people and sort of raise awareness about Indigenous issues and Indigenous poverty, I think we're doing a disadvantage to ourselves.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
Looks like a great initiative. That's your APTN National News for this Friday. For more Indigenous headlines, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you back here Monday.